going through the book of Hebrews, noticing that a couple of things. One is it is a theologically dense letter, right? We've even acknowledged that this is probably a sermon that a pastor gave to his congregation. And it is theologically dense. But what he's doing is trying to warn his congregation about falling back into Judaism. So these are largely Jewish Christians that have accepted Jesus as their Savior, but there's something going on inside the church where they're kind of teetering on going back to practicing Judaism. Whether that was rituals, whether that was participating in the temple, whatever it is, he doesn't never really spell it out for us, but that is the struggle. And so what he's trying to communicate to his congregation is how much better Jesus is than all of the Old Testament stuff that came before. And so his essential argument is, look, the things in the past, the tabernacle, the law of Moses, Joshua leading the people into the promised land, the priesthood, all that stuff, that was good for a time. But now that Jesus is here and all of that is fulfilled, we have something that is so much better. And so we can't possibly go back and revert to what he brought us out of. And so he's been highlighting how Jesus is superior to all of those different things. And so today, he's going to pivot now and start to talk about Jesus' ministry as priest. That's kind of been his focus, but now he's really going to dig in and talk to us about what that is. So let's take out our Bibles and turn. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1, and see what he has to say there. Now, the main point of what we are saying is this. We do have such a great high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. Now, in those two little verses, there is a ton of stuff to unpack. It actually, believe it or not, it doesn't seem like it at a first reading, but here he's kind of flexing his muscles as a good public speaker. Because what he's done is in that first sentence summarize everything that he's talked about in chapters 1 through 7, but then he also sets up in that one sentence what he's going to be talking about through chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. So he basically, remember last week I used the phrase theological weeds. Because last week we really got into the theological weeds. And so then after that, he's basically taking everybody back out of it, right? After talking about Melchizedek and all that stuff, let's take a breath, let's step back and summarize the point of what we have been saying. And the point is right there in verse 1. Now, the main point of what we are saying is this. We do have such a high priest. There it is. So the whole point of chapters 1 through 7 was him building the case that Jesus is the great high priest. That is it. But then in the next sentence, he transitions into what the rest of the book is going to be. And what does he say there? He says, who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. And so what he's done is now pivoted to a new way of talking about Jesus' priestly ministry. Let's go ahead and throw the chart up. I figured the visual aid would be easier for us to see and kind of understand where we've come through in the book of Hebrews. So I want to kind of walk us through this chart really quickly. He brought up this concept of God's domain, the heavens, right? Where God kind of sits on his throne and looks down at the affairs of man. That's where the Son always was. The Son was always with God in this place. But the Son became a human being. That was chapter 2. Right? Chapter 2, he talks about Jesus becoming human, living his life here on earth, and then redeeming us out of that. And that's the idea of fully man, that Jesus humbled himself by becoming a human being, fully God, fully man. And then during Jesus' earthly ministry, he talks about why Jesus is qualified to be the better man, right? All of us sin. We're incapable of saving ourselves. Jesus, however, as a human being, was completely sinless and therefore has the ability to save us. Jesus, as a man, went to the cross and was crucified. Jesus, as a man, was resurrected from the dead, and he conquered not only sin, but death itself. And therefore, he is a better priest. And the reason that Jesus is a better priest is because he is sinless. He's sympathetic. He knows what it's like to be tempted, but he also knows how to conquer it. Unlike the priests in the past who had to offer sacrifices over and over again, Jesus offered a sacrifice once and for all. And so after his earthly ministry was finished, Jesus then goes back to heaven. He goes back to heaven. Remember, he said early on that Jesus passed through the heavens, right? And is now with God. And that's what he's saying right here, that Jesus is now back seated at the right hand of the majesty. That idea of sitting at the right hand of the majesty is basically saying that he's seated at the right hand of God. And so in chapters 1 through 7, everything was focused on Jesus' earthly ministry and how he as a human being is better than all of the Old Testament stuff. But now that he's seated at the right hand of the majesty, the author is going to focus on Jesus' heavenly ministry as our high priest. And so this is what he gets into, is this idea of sitting down at the right hand of the majesty. But this is an interesting phrase. If his whole point is that Jesus is the great high priest who sits down at the right hand of the majesty, all of his congregation at this point would be scratching their heads. They would be asking themselves a question. They would say, wait, this sounds weird. Why would Jesus be the high priest and then sit down? Doesn't that make you confused? Yeah, everyone's like, no, it's not a question I have. I just read that and it seemed to make sense. But the reason it's confusing to them is because the priest does not sit down until he's done priesting. So if his whole point has been Jesus is the eternal high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, as we just read in 7, then why is he saying that Jesus is sitting down? Now do you have the question? Now we get it. We have to go back to his main text that he's been relying on, which is Psalm 110, 1 and 4. He says there, the Lord, Yahweh, says to my Lord, Adonai, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And then in verse 4, he says, you, Lord, have sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now it gets really interesting because this concept of sitting down at the right hand of God, or really any king at that point, means that the person who is sitting there next to the king is a co-regent. They are a co-ruler with the king. And so the image of sitting down next to the right hand of the majesty in heaven is not an image of his priesthood. It is an image of his kingship. And so what the author is doing is taking these two ideas that are right there from Psalms, the idea that God has called this servant, which is Jesus, to sit at his right hand until he makes the enemies his footstool, and also the other idea of being a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, and combining those two things, that Jesus is not only our high priest, but he is also our high king. He is the priest king. And that idea of priest king, believe it or not, is so important for what he's going to say in the rest of this chapter. Because kings, generally speaking, do not serve. Priests do. But this King Jesus, is not only sitting on the throne, he's also sitting on the throne as a servant. To serve who? His people. That means the king is willing to humble himself and serve those that ought to be serving him. We'll see how that plays out. Verse 2, we'll continue. He goes on in verse 2. And who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. Last week I stepped into theologically controversial territory because I love it. It's so much fun. That's what I do. But this week he kind of expands on one of the ideas that we've talked about last week, that all of the Old Testament stuff, it was good, but at this point it's useless because of Jesus. Jesus is so much better. And in this verse he starts to talk about this thing called the tabernacle. Remember, the tabernacle was from the Exodus story. After the Hebrews left Egypt and were wandering through the desert, they set up the tent, which was the tabernacle. And the tabernacle would eventually be built into the temple, right? Solomon would build out of brick, mortar, and gold. He would build an actual temple. Well, the tabernacle was like a portable temple. And so that is where the presence of God would meet heaven and earth. And so now he's saying this really odd thing about this tabernacle, right? And who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by mere human hands. In that verse, he says two very negative, very insulting, if you will, things about that old tabernacle. First, when he calls it the true tabernacle, he's basically saying that with Jesus setting up the real true tabernacle in heaven, that's the real one. The implication then is that the tabernacle on earth was not the real tabernacle. The real tabernacle, the real one that God always wanted, the real sanctuary where the presence of God and human beings would meet was always and has always been in heaven. So this one is not real. Then he says something else. He says that it was built by humans. Another way to think of this is built by human hands. Now this phrase, it's a phrase that's always derogatory in the Bible, and it is most often used to make fun of people that were worshiping idols. That's what it was for. Listen to this. Isaiah 2:8. Their land is filled with idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their own fingers have made. And so to the Hebrews, and then of course to the New Testament authors, to worship something that was made by your own hands is paradoxical. You made that, how can you worship it? And so they would mock that. And so the phrase being made with your hands is an insulting term. But then what that means is, if we follow that logic, he's implying that the temple now and this tabernacle, because we have Jesus, is akin to idolatry. Now again, his audience would be hearing this and scratching their heads, waiting for him to explain this. And like a good speaker, he doesn't. He just leaves it there as a hook. He's going to talk about it later. But right here, he just throws it out there. He's like, yeah, that old tabernacle, it wasn't real. Oh, and by the way, if you go back to that, it's basically practicing idolatry. His whole audience would be, wait, what are you talking about? But the logic follows. If Christ made the true sanctuary up in heaven, then what is the other place? The presence of God doesn't meet there anymore. That was made by human hands. So if we were to leave the real sanctuary, the heavenly place, the thing that Christ set up, to go to things that were made by human hands, that really is a type of idolatry. So it's not the real one. It's become a type of idolatry, and he just leaves it there. The question is, why would he do this? Why would he speak so harshly about something that he said was good? Remember, he's a pastor. He's preaching to his congregation. He wants to make sure that he gets their attention, but he also wants to make sure that he draws a line in the sand. His whole point through the entire book is that all of the old stuff was good, but Jesus fulfilled all of that stuff, and we have Jesus now, and Jesus is superior. So why would we turn our backs on Jesus to go back to these old things? That's his whole point. So he's using this harsh language to snap his congregation out of falling away from Jesus. And as I said, he doesn't explain any more than that, which means we're not going to explain any more than that. We're just going to stew in that for a little bit. We'll talk about it in chapter 9. But he continues then, after laying out this wonderful thesis about where he is going. In verse 3 through 5, he says this: every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. And so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer. If he were on earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already priests who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle. See to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. Let's pause there. So in verse 3 and 4, he starts to kind of just pull on some logical threads that would follow if Jesus truly is the high priest, serving in the heavenly sanctuary. And if Jesus is serving in this heavenly sanctuary, it makes sense then that every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. And so it was necessary for this one, referring to Jesus, also to have something to offer. And he doesn't explain it. He just leaves it there again. Another hook for the congregation. But he will explain it in chapter 10. Spoiler alert, it's Jesus on the cross. That's what he's talking about. That's the sacrifice that Jesus offered, but that's what qualifies him to be the high priest in heaven. But then he goes into 4 and 5 to talk a little bit more about this idea of the tabernacle versus Jesus' sanctuary up in heaven. Listen again to what he says. If he were on earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already priests who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. What is he saying there? He's basically saying, listen, there's already this priesthood that's offering sacrifices according to the law, which they already established in chapter 7 was fulfilled. So they're kind of going through this futile motion thing, right? The Levites, all of it. Well, if they're doing this futile thing, Jesus, there's no space for him there. He's at the real place. So he can't possibly priest on earth, therefore he must be in heaven. And he goes on to explain this even more. In verse 5, he says, they serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. So he introduces this idea of shadows and copies. You can think of them as facsimiles. And he goes to Moses to explain what is going on. When Moses went up to Mount Sinai, God gave him the instructions on how to build the tabernacle. But that tabernacle that Moses built was conceptually only a copy of what God was already doing. Let's go ahead and put up the image of the sanctuary really quickly. You remember we used this image a while back when we were going through Hebrews to talk about the way that it was conceptually communicating where God's presence was and where human beings were. And so you can see that outer edge of the temple area. That was the outer courts. That's where anybody could come in. And during the Day of Atonement, they would enter into those courts and they would be ready to offer their sacrifices. But inside that border, you'll see another tent that's set up. And inside that tent are two rooms. One of them is the holy place. That's where you see the lampstand and the altar and the bread and the incense burning. And then behind that was another curtain. And in that curtain was the most holy place. This is where the Ark of the Covenant was. And it was in this room where the presence of God would meet earth. Remember, there's the cherubim. They're looking down to humanity. Inside the ark is the 10 Commandments, and that's a symbol of God's judgment seat, which would be turned into the mercy seat. This is the tabernacle. But remember, the tabernacle is showing and teaching us the separation that exists between us and God. In the outer courts, anybody can go in, but they can't go into the holy place. And they can't certainly go into the most holy place because there is separation. But God's sanctuary, it's where his presence is. It's where it always has been. And so what this is simply a copy of what already exists in heaven. God's abode, his presence. And so the author calls this a shadow. He calls it a copy, something that was always there to teach people of what the real thing was, which is heaven. And it was always pointing that direction. So what Moses made was a copy, not the real thing. And because it's a copy, because it's a shadow, all of the serving that's taking place there because of Christ is now meaningless and useless. Again, he's really laying it on thick about this stuff being done and over with. But there's a reason for that. And he's going to explain that in verses 6 and 7. So let's keep going. But in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. For if there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. So we'll pause there. Now that he's established that Jesus is the better priest, and now that he's established that the tabernacle was just a shadow and a copy, it wasn't the real thing, the presence of God is the real thing, and that's where Jesus is, he goes to continue and contrast these ideas, right? Because Jesus is the new priest, that means there must be a new covenant, a new law, which we looked at last week. But if he's a superior priest, that means he's also the priest of a superior covenant. And this is the whole point of where he's trying to go, to this idea of covenant. And so he says there in verse 7 that, let's read it one more time. For if there had been nothing wrong with the first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. In other words, that old covenant, the old terms of relating to God that set up the temple, the priesthood, the sacrificial system, and all of that stuff, it was good, but there was a problem with it. And if there wasn't a problem with it, people wouldn't have been looking for a new covenant. And so he talks about better promises. And so the question is, what does he even mean by these things, promises? What does he even mean by this thing called covenant and all of that stuff? Way back in chapter 1, when we talked about the book of Hebrews, we said that it is a theology of relationship with God. So once again, we get into the theological weeds, the thick of it. People are going, this is really cool. If you're a theo nerd, you love it. If you don't, you're like, what are we even talking about here? Like, how am I going to make this applicable to my life? Well, here it is. He's talking about relationship with God. That's his whole point. And now he's going to start to lay out how all of this stuff means that we have better relationship with God right now. See, when he uses the word covenant, it's not like a law or anything like that. A covenant is something deeper than just a written contract where we sign on the dotted line. A covenant, it's deep, it's long lasting, and it's certainly between people. Think of it as like a solemn pledge. The best thing that we have in our culture to relate to that is marriage. When you get married, assuming it's in a church, if it's by Elvis in Vegas, I don't know what happens. But if it was at a church and with a pastor, you walk down the aisle, right? The bride meets the groom, and there they exchange their vows. And when they exchange their vows, they're exchanging their promises, their lifelong commitment to each other, and then hopefully their lifelong commitment to each other under Christ. That's the idea. That's what a covenant is. It's deeper. It's relational. It's long-term. It's a solemn vow and a pledge. And these are rules, yes, foundational rules for relationship. And every relationship has rules, right? It does, because if you didn't have rules, then you couldn't stay in good relationship. When we think about marriage, right, they give the spoken vows at the altar, but there's also other rules that apply that are unspoken, right, husbands? Sometimes we spend most of our marriage trying to figure out those unspoken rules. Just, Aurora, I love you. You're the best. Got to throw that out there. But there are rules spoken. And if you don't stick to those spoken rules, the relationship disintegrates, right? You promise to be faithful to each other. So if one of those parties has an affair, what happens to the relationship? It implodes. It disintegrates. We have relationships with our kids, not spoken rules, but parents, you know, there are rules. Nobody wrote it down. They didn't have you sign the contract of what you're supposed to do to take care of your kid at the hospital or anything like that, but you know that there are rules. You at least have to feed them and clothe them, right? At minimum. Water, too. You gotta water them, right? You gotta house break them when they're young. Like, there's just all these different things that you have to do with kids, and we know that is, and we don't have to speak it. And then we know that when a parent neglects their kids, we can call it abuse, because they're not fulfilling what we know to be the relational rules that govern that. But also with friendships, we know that you cannot steal, you cannot lie about, and you cannot gossip about a friend. If you were to do that to your friend, what would happen to the relationship? It would disintegrate. This is the idea of covenant. And it's important for us to understand, because when he talks about the old covenant not being good and there being a problem with that old covenant and the need for a better covenant, that is a better way to relate to God, he's going to explain exactly how good this new way of relating to God is. And so the new covenant does establish a better way to relate to God, because the old covenant wasn't good. So if he says better promises, we got to figure out what the old promise was, right? So let's really quickly figure out what that old promise was. Then we'll look at the new promise and see exactly why this relationship dynamic is so much better than before. In Exodus 19:3, this is right before Moses, by the way, receives the 10 commandments and takes it down to the Israelites. So here he is on Mount Sinai with God. And then God says this. Here's the story. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you were to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you were to tell the people of Israel. You yourself have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." You see that? Brought you to myself. This is relational. Verse 5. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. And the people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." Why is that so important? It's important because this covenant vow comes before the written law. God started this whole thing with a promise, not the written law, not the 10 Commandments, not the you can't eat lobster or pork or my favorite things, right? All of that. It started with covenant and promise because it is. These are vows. But what makes this an inferior promise to what God would give later? The key is in verse 5. "If you obey me fully and keep my covenant." That's it. If you obey me fully. Why is that an inferior one? Have you ever tried to read Leviticus? It's a tough read. There's a lot of rules in there, a lot of regulations, rules about fence height, rule about why you can't sew leather onto fabric, rules about mixing meat with dairy, so no cheeseburgers, you can't do that. All kinds of things, and then things that make sense to us, like don't murder, don't steal, right? We're good with that, okay? Honor your father and mother. We're good with those things. But there's a lot of rules in there, and at some point, those rules get to be a little overbearing. I'm not critiquing God, but the author's gonna make this point. If you obey me fully and keep my covenant. So that promise was built on a condition. And the condition of that promise was built on the people's obedience to keep the covenant. Which means, if the people disobeyed, what happened to the covenant? It was no longer fulfilled. And relationship with God would continually be fractured. This is why he says what he says in verse 7 and 8. "For if there had been nothing wrong with the first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. But God found fault with the people and said." God found fault with the people, not with the covenant, not with the promise, but the people's inability to remain faithful to what God had written out. And because the people were incapable of fulfilling all of the law that God had, because they couldn't do it, the conditional promise then, something needed to be done, because the relationship would always be bad. And so now the author has put these two ideas together. From last week, that the law was useless because it could not make anyone righteous. It was obedience, it was sacrifice, it was rote, it was ritual, but it couldn't actually make anybody righteous. And on top of that, the people could not keep the covenant. But it was always God's desire to have relationship with his people. When I brought you out of Egypt to myself, that was always the goal. And even if he says, "If you keep my covenant, you will be my most treasured possession." So for God, it was always about relationship, but the old terms weren't working. And because the old terms weren't working, not because God did anything wrong, not because the law in and of itself was bad, but because the people couldn't do it, something new had to be done. A new relationship, a new way of relating to God. And so then the author goes on in 8 through 13. "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel," there it is, "and the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will establish with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, for I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete, and what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear." So there the author goes back to the Old Testament, to the prophet Jeremiah, where Jeremiah was looking and saying, look, The people aren't obeying this. God has now allowed Israel to be judged by other nations, but this is never what God wanted in the first place. So, because it's not working, I'm going to make a new one. And then he concludes this section with verse 13. Not just done, right, but obsolete. Listen to what he says there in verse 13. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. Again, this is really harsh language. The idea is not just that it's old, like a worn out pair of shoes. It's more like old in the sense of a dead animal that is decaying on the side of the road. That's the image he has of the old covenant. When he says soon disappear, he means it's decaying and eventually it will be completely gone and no one's ever going to see it again. Why so harsh? Again, because what we have is so much better than what they had before. And how could we turn our backs on Christ to go to this old way of relating? He needs his congregation to know that going back to the temple system, living under ritual law after Christ is useless. It's going back to dead things, and it's akin to idolatry. And so in order for us to understand the magnitude of what he's saying, we have to get into this thing. So what is so great about the new covenant? What is so great about what Jesus did for us in terms of relating to God? Let's go back to Jeremiah 31:33 and see what he has to say. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. That's what's so good about the new covenant. The old covenant stands in contrast to every single one of those elements. Let's go ahead and put up the chart really quickly. I was on like a chart binge this week. I thought, let's just do charts, right? Let's do that. But this is the big difference, right? Because in the old covenant, we had sacrifice and ritual, right? They would have to go to the priest. They would have to bring a goat. They would have to bring a lamb, and that would have to be sacrificed. And the blood would be sprinkled on the mercy seat on the Day of Atonement. Right? But now in the new one, there's actual forgiveness of sins. Christ was the sacrifice once and for all. So there's no more sacrificing over and over and over again. There's no more penance over and over and over again. There's no more dead goats and sheep every single year. That's done away with. Now our sins are not atoned for by the blood of animals, but by Christ. And so now the new covenant is built on forgiveness of sins. Listen, forgiven and forgotten. For I will remember their sins no more. But because this covenant is built on forgiveness and no more sacrifices, that means we have perfect union with God. The real sanctuary that he always intended for us to be in his presence, we have that now. But the temple and the tabernacle were separated by curtains. People couldn't go into the most holy place. But now, because of the forgiveness that's offered by Jesus, the curtain is torn and we have the presence of God with us at all times. In fact, I'll even say it this way. Paul says, do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit? What that means is that inner place, I'm going to throw my slide team a little curveball. Let's go back to that tabernacle real quick. See if they can do it. Ninjas. Inside the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant was, that's the most holy place. That's where God's presence met earth. When Paul says, you are temples of the Holy Spirit, he says, you are holies of holies, walking around this earth because inside of you dwells the very presence of God, union with God, no more curtains. We have direct access to God at all times. In the past, everything was mediated by priests. We couldn't go into those curtains. We couldn't go into those places. I couldn't offer sacrifices for myself. The priest had to offer sacrifices. Even my tithes were collected by the priest before they could be given to God. Everything was mediated by another person. But in this new covenant, he says, no, it's not going to happen anymore. Everybody's going to know me from the least to the greatest. Everyone's going to know who I am. We have direct access to God. No more priest except the great high priest, Jesus. The old covenant was built on laws and rules, and it always produced disobedience. But here we have been transformed into obedience of the heart. God says, I will write my law on their minds and write it in their hearts. It's not about the list of rules. It's about the simplicity of the heart of God, to love him with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And then him transforming us into this new creature so that we desire to do the things that God wants us to do. If we understand that, then we understand the greatness of the new covenant. Can't you see what Jesus has done for us? He gave us access to a much better relationship with God, better than it ever was before. One that's based on forgiveness, that brings us into unity, not rules and regulations and sacrifice. And so it makes sense then from the author's perspective. If this is what Jesus has done for all of us and still does for us to this day, how could we possibly go back to what was before? It makes no sense. It is spitting on the cross. So today, this is the covenant that we live under. This is what we have to have. But I will wager that a lot of us in the room still struggle with what I'm going to call an old covenant mentality. That is, we relate to this God in still kind of an old covenant way. Let me start with this. How many of you have ever thought to yourselves, I gotta be good enough to make God happy? I gotta do all the right things so that God isn't angry with me. Dude, that's old covenant legalistic thinking. Because that's not living under the forgiveness of sins. That's thinking I got to do stuff myself so that I can be righteous enough. It's self-righteousness. But what happens when we have that mentality is we start to live this legalistic life. I call it walking on eggshells. God doesn't want you to walk on eggshells when it comes to relationship with him. He doesn't want you to live your life thinking that you're just one step off the tightrope to making him angry and upset with you. It's like we talked about a couple weeks ago, the angry judge. That's not who God is. For some of us, these might be subtle ways of walking on the eggshells. For others, it might be glaring and we see it all the time. Remember the old covenant? If you obey me fully and keep my covenant. And we think that's what we got to do today. We think that in order to be in good relationship with God, we have to be perfect and keep the rules to make him happy. And I think this can come in two different ways. One of those is with sin, right? We think that if we sin, God isn't happy with us. Now, to be clear, God is not happy with your sin. This is not an endorsement to say like, no, go for it. God's good, he's gonna, no, that's not what we're saying. That's not what we're saying at all. But we do get to this idea that where if we do sin, like maybe some of us have addiction, maybe some of us have habitual sins, or maybe we lash out in anger and say things that we ought not, that God is again that judge ready to hammer on us. The other one is following God's will. I have heard so many people either ask me or contemplate, what is God's will for my life? And then God's will becomes, again, another tightrope act where you got to balance and make sure that you do everything the way God wants you to do. Does he want me to have Cheerios this morning or Fruit Loops? The answer is neither because they're unhealthy. But in reality, like as a teacher, I experience this all the time with young students. I want to know God's will. Who's my spouse? I want to know God's will for that. I want to know God's will for where I have to go to college. And kids would sweat bullets trying to make sure they chose the place that God wanted them to go to. That's not the type of relationship God wants for us. He does not want a walking on eggshells tightrope relationship. He wants one that's built on grace and forgiveness. If we live our lives like this, we will always be at odds with God mentally in this old covenant way of living because we're not perfect. We will always mess up. Any sinless people in this room? Yeah, I didn't think so. None of us. We always mess up. We always miss God's will to a point. And if that's the way it is, we could never be in perfect relationship. It's not that God is happy with our sin. It's not that God is like permissive of anything with it. No, God is not happy with our sin. He's not happy when we mess up, but he's happy with you. In fact, he loves you so much and still hates your sin so much that he's willing to die for you to forgive you of that sin so that he can still have a relationship with you. That's the new covenant. Sometimes we live in an old covenant mentality when we carry the guilt and shame for past sins, our past mistakes. You don't have to show your hands for this one, but I'm going to wager there's a bunch of us in here that still carry guilt from the past. that still carry shame from that thing we said that we know deeply hurt somebody. Those things, those sins that have come up, and we carry that weight. But that guilt and shame for the past is not a new covenant way of relating. In the new covenant, God says, I will forgive their sins and remember them no more. So if God can forget, why can't you? See, this new covenant relationship, God not only forgives, but he lets it go. He forgets it. So why do we hold on to the guilt? Why do we hold on to the shame? Is it this idea that maybe you've got to do enough penance, that you got to do, like enough things so that you can finally get rid of the guilt? Or do you think it's just like you're a burden to carry through life because it's what I did? That's not the new covenant. That's not the way of relating to God. Forgiving and forgetting. Do you think that God can't possibly forgive and forget what you've done? I think a lot of people believe the lie that God can't forgive that particular sin. Whatever it is in your life, whatever you've done, that God can't forgive that because it is so bad. That's not what the covenant says. John says it this way: he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. The next way that we live in old covenant mentality is obedience for the sake of obedience rather than from the heart. See, God doesn't want us to obey the law because we're always afraid of him. God doesn't want us to obey his commandments. He doesn't want us to live our lives his way so that we can just make it through the door and get into heaven and not go to the other place because it's really hot. He doesn't want us to do that. He wants us to have a genuine heart transformation where the good works flow from that. A desire to do things his way because we have a loving relationship with him. A genuine desire to obey him. The best way that I can think of it is a marriage analogy. It's not that we get giddy about doing some of the things that we have to do. We don't. If I think about marriage, there are things that I have to do to maintain a quality marriage and a quality life within our house that I don't always want to do. I don't always want to sweep the floor. I don't always want to do dishes right after dinner. I don't always want to have to grill burgers, then go clean the Blackstone. And if you guys know what a miserable mess that is, it's awful. I don't always want to do that. I don't always want to do the dishes afterwards. I certainly don't want to work with the kids fighting over who's got to do the dishes and dry and all that kind of. I just don't want to. There's things I don't want to do, but I got to do it. You know what I don't like doing is making the bed. Some of you are like, what the heck? It is one of the most futile things because it's only going to be made for a couple hours and then we're going to go mess it up again. Yes, it looks nice. Yes, it feels like a hotel or whatever. Sure, whatever. It's one of the most futile things. But what do I do it? Because my wife likes it. That's why I do it. If I were a bachelor, I could not care less. I have no idea how old my sheets would be if I was a bachelor. No clue. But I do these things, and it's not that I like the thing, it's that I love my wife. And so I do those things out of a desire to maintain the relationship. See, that's what God is after. The law gave us all of these rules and regulations. Could you imagine if Aurora gave me a honey-do list with all of these regulations and things to say, hey, if you want me to be happy, do this. What a miserable marriage that would be, right? Unless it was a short list, that would be cool. But if it were long, no, nobody would like that. But that's kind of what the law was. God said, if you want to relate to me, here's how you got to do it. Don't wear this, wear this. Eat these animals, don't eat these animals. Make your fence this high when you're in the roof. If you have to use a bathroom, walk a mile out of your camp to do it. All of these things. I'm like, what the heck? I can't do this. So in this new covenant is not built on that. It's built on true relationship. Jesus says it this way: if you love me, keep my commandments. It's not keep my commandments because I said so. If you love me, keep my commandments. That is the greatness of the new covenant. It has been completely transformed from regulation to relationship, and that's why Jesus is so great. Because of the cross, he has fundamentally changed the way that we relate to God, from legalism and guilt to forgiveness and love, and more importantly, complete union with God in the heavenly sanctuary. Let's stand.